Okay, so I wanted to take a look at where we left off. I got some interesting follow-ups from previous broadcasts. Probably not going to finish up this topic because I just keep finding things that like build off at top of each other. Then there were some comments on my other videos I wanted to look at, and yeah, just some kind of interesting things in the past video. So let's real quick get a refresher, kind of skim through last video. So we brushed up on the definitions. We looked through this video, which was
alongside the same
kind of disappointing, but it was still a good video. Just kind of different perspective than what I was hoping for. Then I think we looked at some, did we look at other like extreme or opposite views? I think we looked at some opposite views there. And then we had something I wanted to leave off on. So we'll start on whatever we left off on. Oh, okay. I wanted to look at some Hassan, since he's a well-known kind of left view. And then what was the extreme other side? Prager. There we go. So let's get two kind of general prominent extreme, but they're not, okay, let's not use the word extreme. Two prominent polar opposite, or the best we can find, views on nationalism. We'll start off with that. So, but before I get to that, some really weird stuff I want to just kind of touch on. So with this first video that I put on YouTube, which I recommend looking at or at least skimming through for some context, for some reason popped up some filter or whatever these are, in information blobs. Why am I seeing this? When you search or watch videos related to topics prone to misinformation, such as the moon landing, you may see an additional panel at the top of your search results or under a video you're watching. Information panels show basic info sourced from independent third-party partners to give more context on a topic. You want to learn more? I actually do want to learn more, but maybe that's for another day. They will show regardless of what opinions or perspectives are expressed in a video, which I hope that's what's happening. But I generally find them on conspiratorial videos. Like I haven't really found any on, like, let's say like a news website or like a news broadcast on YouTube, even though it may trigger those kinds of words. But let's just hope that I just didn't research enough. But that's kind of just what I found in like the very brief amount of time that I tried looking into it. Information panels may not be available in countries. Okay, was this helpful? No, it wasn't. But we'll skip that. So on this video, like, I didn't touch on anything QAnon related. I spoke about nationalism, its definition, I looked at different video breakdowns of it and their opinions. Like, we had a kind of like a leftist perspective, maybe like a central, more neutral perspective. And I thought it was very, like, for the most part, non-opinion oriented. And just kind of like looking at what's out there and sort of interpreting it. And for some reason this popped up. So QAnon, or simply Q, is a disproven and discredited far-right conspiracy theory alleging that a secret cabal of Satan-worshipping cannibalistic is running a global... Okay, yeah. I'm very apprehensive of even putting this in a YouTube video after I edit, because it's probably going to trigger it again. And I'm not sure... I still have to upload the part 2 that we did, like the last Twitch video I just skimmed through. So if that triggers it again, which I think it would, since saying the same words, I didn't even say anything remotely similar to anything I said in here was a nationalism. Like, nothing else on here, and not even in this context. It was just speaking like in general terms of nationalism and Trump. So but I find it very ironic that it triggers this in the context of a video which attempts to more neutrally discuss and break down topics so that you can understand and remove inappropriate or bad interpretations of other people to understand them better and communicate better. In a ironic juxtaposition, this giant tag of just complete compartmentalization and bias of a topic is just stamped right on top of there, just potentially crushing a viewer's open-minded perspective on what is about to be said or what has been said. Like, a normal person might read one of these things and just like subliminally manifest thoughts directly from that, which influence them in a positive or negative way towards the video. And it's not a good positive or negative influence or potential influence. It's overall negative because the context is so generally applied and it's not like broken down and clarified or even attached to a specific phrase, sentence, or word. It's just stamped on there. Almost like, how could you equate that? Maybe if you owned a gun shop and, okay, let's say this. You owned a gun shop, right? You rented a retail space. So you have some kind of landlord, right? And it's like saying your landlord went to your business and right outside of your window of your gun shop, he put a sign that says, guns are killing people every day. Guns will kill people. If you want to learn more, click, like, visit here. It's like putting that sign right in front of a gun shop. It's like, wait a minute. It's you're influencing the person who's about to come in here. Like maybe the person is just coming in because they like shooting at a shooting range. They like hunting. They just like collecting. There's a subliminal effect, which is a bad thing because of the lack of clarity and specificity and where it's being directed to where the message is attempting to identify. It's just a blanket term, but okay. On the other hand, though, I can see where they're coming from in that how do we battle videos or sources of information where there's a potential to have misinformation, disinformation, which is intentionally bad, which is intentionally mixed truth with mixed falsehoods, or which is unintentionally done that way. So it's like, how do you, as a platform, how do you attempt to influence people to adhere to an actual journalistic approach to topics and ideas? And to me, that has to be a part of what they're doing. You know, I mean, and it's obviously not all encompassing, but like a part of that, there has to be that feeling or that desire in some organic fashion at some level. Could be the ultimate level of the person who owns everything, or could just be a group of workers who feel the same, who are creating an algorithm which does this and that, which produces this result. So I can see from their perspective, it's a difficult position to be put in. You're responsible in a way for being a platform that has the ability to influence a group of people or a massive amount of people. And if your platform is producing like extreme negative results, which are nearly impossible to fix, there is an argument to be made that either someone needs to be an example, or there needs to be a set of guidelines for the website for the user to adhere to be part of it, because ultimately it's their website. But you can certainly see like where the argument from both sides kind of comes from there. And if it's producing results like you see in my video, I don't think they're anywhere near a level which is a good application of the theory. Or maybe it is. Maybe you have to actually just know their intent. Maybe they just want to stop the conversations altogether, in which this is a good way to get there, to the point where you just start banning people altogether. But I'm not saying that's what they're doing, but that would be a good route to gradually introduce, the theory of gradualism, where you just a little bit more regulation until there is or isn't a subliminal goal to get to. I don't know if that's the right word. Not secret, but you get the point. Kind of a side note, just thought it was very ironic, a weird juxtaposition. Okay, what else did we want to get to? Oh, there were some comments on these past videos too. I put some of these videos on Reddit, and this is just Reddit in general, but I don't know what this guy was talking about with ad hominem. I said this and he downvoted me. Kind of funny, I guess. This guy said he was just correct, and I disagree. Just think it's a potential effect. There might have been more. I forget, but that's okay. Okay, so let's look up some it's good old YouTube. guess we can look it up on here. This might be... See, this is more directed towards white nationalism, which is different than nationalism.
Bra that fits my small chest. For as long as I can remember, being small was something to be embarrassed about.
Hi, Tucker Carlson's white pilling your dads. Hi, Tucker Carlson's white pilling your dads every night.
On the left, you may have noticed everything is about race. Everything, even things that have nothing to do with race.
There's one thing Tucker Carlson hates. It's continuing to wear bow ties. That and talking about race. Unless it's about preserving the white race.
So we're just going to ignore all the ad hominems and all those kind of jokes revolving around, you know, the sarcasm, the Daily Show kind of comedy, I guess if you want to call it that, just commentary. And we'll try to subtract out all that so that we're left with some kind of substantial argument.
Continuing to wear bow ties. That and talking about race. Unless it's about preserving the white race.
Everybody gets a safe space except white men. They are hated and despised. Attacking white men for being white men. Attack white men for their privilege in a whole bunch of ways.
I was handed a box of saltine crackers, and in a group chat during the event, a student photoshopped my face onto a cracker.
This is what Tucker Carlson's doing with Bill O'Reilly's coveted 8 p.m. slot on Fox News, which is currently the third most popular cable news show in the country.
By the way, just to pause, I assume that's a slur against your ethnicity, correct?
I've talked about this on my Twitch a lot, but only the most important subjects are covered on Tucker's show, like white genocide, which is in fact something that the left is advocating for, apparently.
But he did not notably advocate for genocide. A Georgetown professor called Christine Fair did do that.
Imagine being a producer on Tucker's show, constantly scouring the internet looking for blue checkmark Twitter users saying dumb things while they're emotionally distraught in order to make wild claims like that the left is advocating for white genocide. Of course, this isn't how white genocide is actually happening. According to the folks Tucker is mirroring, white genocide is happening because immigration is changing the nation's demographics, and it's being justified by an evil liberal plot called diversity.
Diversity is our strength, they screech, as if that settles the conversation by itself, like a magic talisman.
Diversity. We hear about it nonstop. It's the mainstream motto.
Tucker's relentless attacks against diversity, multiculturalism, and immigrants as a whole are literally identical to white supremacists, white nationalists, and neo-Nazis. They're also reductive and oftentimes completely baseless comparisons.
Stop. It's the mainstream motto.
Tucker's relentless attacks against diversity, multiculturalism, and immigrants as a whole are...
Okay, I'm not sure if he's representing his ideas properly. This may or may not be the case, but he may be taking buzzwords and applying different kind of interpretations onto Tucker or wherever else that girl was. Let me see if we can hear this. Tucker's
Diversity is our strength, they
justified by an evil liberal plot called diversity.
Diversity is our strength, they screech, as if that settles the conversation by itself, like a magic talisman.
Diversity. We hear about it nonstop. It's the mainstream motto.
Tucker's...
See, they're talking about diversity, and there may be several different arguments that revolve around diversity. And typically today, you hear something of diversity as, or what I interpret it as, diversity as a statistical outcome, so that we want to make sure that people are properly and equally represented among different diverse races, demographics. Yeah, let's just say demographics. And with that argument, you can go a few different ways. You can be completely neutral. You can go something in the positive or potentially positive which would state something along the lines of to strive for diversity or impose diversity rather than a merit-based outcome of demographics would be in and of itself indirectly unequal for certain people. In other words, it would say that although something like affirmative action is there to make sure a demographic is appropriately represented, it imposes itself into a potentially merit-based field so that one person may acquire something regardless or without the prioritization of merit. So maybe a person of a certain race would get a job or some kind of application or opportunity, not based in merit, a demographic qualification, which is ironically the opposite of equality of opportunity. It's more forced equality of outcome, which in turn indirectly indirectly stifles someone else. Whether they are the majority or the minority would be irregardless. It would be the fact of not prioritizing merit would be, what's the right word? Like a moral inconsistency? I'm not sure how to say that right or kind of describe that right. Diversity could be argued in that fashion to where you're indirectly stifling someone else where they may have deserved it with the intent of producing an equal outcome rather than giving an equal opportunity. And so on the other hand, diversity could go along the ways of, well, we want to keep this area pure we don't want diversity. And in that kind of argument, that's where you would follow the line of logic that you may be thinking something equal to some sort of race-specific nationalism, like white nationalism or whatever it may be. So, in other words, he's interpreting those arguments and he's ignoring one facet and only interpreting what he feels that Tucker is saying, which may or may not be the case. I don't know, but you'd have to ask him very specific questions. You basically have to take those two scenarios which I described and ask him if he aligns somewhere within that spectrum or if it's outside in a different construct of a spectrum. But you get the idea of where it can be positive or negative in that perspective of diversity. It doesn't have to deduce to wanting some kind of oppressive form of nationalism, but it can.
Relentless attacks against diversity, multiculturalism, and immigrants as a whole are literally identical to white supremacists, white nationalists, and neo-Nazis. They're also reductive and oftentimes completely baseless comparisons.
And in his defense, if for some reason he has misinterpreted, or which is consciously or unconsciously, if he has interpreted Tucker as doing that negative behavior or kind of thought process, then he would be more justified in giving that kind of a conclusion. But because he jumps to it so fast, it shows poor conduct or poor communication or poor interpretation. And it's not a good behavior to follow. Specificity, and you want to ask questions or at least have a forum where the questions are specifically answered to give you an unbiased interpretation. The most pure form of them saying and acting out what they believe or want.
Precisely is diversity our strength? Since you've made this our new national motto, please be specific as you explain it.
Well, for one, diverse executive boards generate better returns, among countless other studies that...
And it seems what he's doing here, and probably what a lot of these videos do, is kind of misinterpret things and impose their own discussion within it. They replace or answer their questions.
Show the many benefits of diversity, but I'm sure the biases of racially anxious agitators are more important than empirical evidence.
Can you think, for example, of other instances?
And it's all the questions he answers himself, and he draws these misinterpretations, or they might be correct interpretations, but these very brief quotes, he draws them to a brief conclusion, which is not representative of the full story in this kind of satirical fashion, which is very, very opposite of journalism. To me, this kind of video format feels journalistic, but it's just really not.
Institutions such as, marriage or military units, in which the less people have in common, the more cohesive they are.
Well, Tucker, you have the most in common with your family members. Are you suggesting keeping marriage within your family? Why do you want to have sex with your cousins, Tucker? Also, as far as non-diverse militaries go, maybe you should open a history book and take that up with General Robert E. Lee. Go on, Tuck. What else?
Latin American countries are changing election outcomes here. by forcing demographic change on this country at a rate that American voters consistently say they don't want.
This assertion is preposterous because, I mean, it's completely untrue. Just look at polling data. 75% of Americans say that immigration is a good thing. So who are the Americans you're referring to here? These guys?
It sounds to me
General Robert E. Lee.
Latin American countries are changing election outcomes. Latin American countries are changing election outcomes here by forcing demographic change on this country at a rate that American voters consistently say they don't want.
This assertion is preposterous because
There's a whole argument there, which I don't even. You need way more information from him to come to any.
I mean, it's completely
conclusion.
untrue. Just look at polling data. 75% of Americans say that immigration is a good thing. So
It seems like these kind of video formats are good for like cherry picking things and drawing the cherry picked, possibly misinterpreted thing to its conclusion and then destroying that. I mean, inherently, if you take any kind of discussion and just cherry pick it and omit things, you're going to come to a complete conclusion which is not correct, even if it's on the same kind of topic or thing they're talking about. It's, you need long format.
who are the Americans you're referring to here? These guys?
it sounds to me like we got a problem with people who got here legally altering the landscape politically. I don't like it. You stop it.
But I guess we should just run the country on the white fragility of crying neo-Nazis as opposed to the overwhelming majority of Americans' wishes. But play us out, Tucker. Give us a cherry-picked example that could easily be countered with facts.
Hazleton's population was 2% Hispanic. Just 16 years later, Hazleton is majority Hispanic. That's a lot of change. People who grew up in Hazleton return to find out they can't communicate with the people who now live there, and that's bewildering for people.
Hazleton's a perfect example of immigrants saving a small coal mining town from absolute economic annihilation by opening up small businesses, and even the large immigrant-run corporations who have brought jobs over to the small town. This is, of course, despite the efforts made by the white population to fight off the immigrant scourge with unconstitutional regulations. And even the Nat Geo article that you're using here to advance your narrative mentions the reality that immigration has drastically improved Hazleton. But you won't hear that part because Tucker's not in the business of making America better. He's just trying to do white identity politics. And I'm sorry to tell you this, Tucker, but facts don't care about your feelings.
Now, that brings up a really interesting kind of philosophical question, because last time we looked at nationalism and its possible negative and positive connotations or meanings, we saw that if you have a country who is in favor of, let's say, speaking a certain language, because if you have a country which has a native language and they're accustomed to speaking, that's all, they only know one language, and then you have people immigrating, it's fair to say that you can be neutral when you say you want the person coming into your country to communicate to you with the native language instead of them imposing their language upon you. It's just a form of, I guess, consideration or intent, which isn't to say that you can't not want to learn that language and kind of blend it in with yours, and, you know, kind of just to communicate. And it's not to say that you couldn't have a bad intent in saying that this is our native language, you can't speak these other languages because I can't understand you. But that can be bad or good. I mean, it can be bad in that, sure, it might be like them feeling threatened and saying, get out of here. Or it just may be them saying, I'm lazy. I don't care about other languages. Just learn mine. And this kind of stubborn, lazy, I don't have time to learn language, whatever. I don't know. It's very dependent on the person. And there's a lot of factors you have to think about. But so having said that, it's interesting that if there's a community or a city where you have mass immigration, how would you then interpret that? For example, if you have, let's just make everything even numbers. You have America with 300 million people. Okay, let's say a big chunk, let's make everything perfectly clean. So a big chunk of America migrated to another part of America. So 100 million people moved from the south and they moved north. So that now it's kind of split in half. And now where those 100 million people were displaced, you have 50 million immigrants from Latin America, South America, into that part of America. and they all don't speak English. So how would that argument play out now that they are in that territory? It's still America. It's just everyone got displaced. Let's just say for work, for whatever reason. Who has the it's my house, play by my rules kind of status? And that's not to say like it's my house, play by my rules or get out. It's just the consideration. If I go into someone else's house, I want to be considerate of their ways of doing things, how they're speaking, their language. I don't want to change myself, but I want to be considerate and, kind of communicate properly. So be interesting how that would play out if something like that happened, because that's essentially what he's saying has happened in this situation, or that's what Tucker was saying. That apparently, I don't know if I'm kind of representing this well, but there was apparently a region where it was poor for some reason, whatever. Let's say it's an old coal mine town. They got displaced. People immigrated into that, opened up businesses, and now it's like a normal functioning city or town again. And now the natives go back there, and they might be frustrated, or they might be genuinely like hateful to the people who are now in the town. All the things are kind of reporting on here. It's like you really need more information on the whole thing. But it's an interesting kind of scenario.
To find out they can't communicate with the people who now live there. And that's bewildering for people.
Hazleton's a perfect example of immigrants saving a small coal mining town from absolute economic annihilation by opening up small businesses, and even the large immigrant-run corporations who have brought jobs over to the small town. This is, of course, despite the efforts made by the white population to fight off the immigrant scourge with unconstitutional regulations. And even the Nat Geo article that you're using here to advance your narrative mentions the reality that immigration has drastically improved Hazleton. But you won't hear that part because Tucker's not in the business of making America better. He's just trying to do white identity politics. And I'm sorry to tell you this, Tucker, but facts don't care about your feelings. I'm Hassan Piker. If you're mad that one of the biggest cable news shows is spreading white nationalist propaganda, please share this video with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, join me live every day from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. Pacific at twitch.tv/Hassanabi.
So, due to the fact that he just has no clarification on anything, and it's just that disingenuous way of commentating on things, I don't think it's fair for him to just say stuff like that, like they're spreading white nationalist propaganda. But I can totally understand why he may think that, and why he may, he sounds just kind of angry, or maybe it's just his style of commentating, but I could totally understand where he's coming from. And I totally disagree, unless there's some kind of like long form proving all these points. So let's look at the opposite spectrum, which would be Prager. This is actually a good video to follow up on, whoever this is debunking. So they're debunking it. We watched this one before too. Also, I wanted to see, because we're just looking on YouTube stuff, is this how people generally feel? Like, for example, maybe we can get some like Pew research into how people feel about nationalism. So let's keep this up so we can get back to that. Because I think that's an important perspective too, because you have, even though some of these things are reporting on media, internet cultures, I think it's very important to have the common person's perspective on even something as simple as what is nationalism.
Britain votes to leave the European Union. The United States elects a president who says he'll put America first. Around the world, nationalism is winning elections. Many see this nationalist revival as the great danger of our time, fearing that nationalism will take us back to a more primitive and racist past. But it wasn't long ago that great political figures such as Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, David Ben-Gurion and Mahatma Gandhi, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher recognized what I call the virtue of nationalism. So what is this virtue? A nationalist believes that the world is governed best when nations are free to chart their own independent course, cultivating their traditions and pursuing their interests without interference. Nationalism is not about racism. All nations are internally diverse. And it isn't about isolationism. Of course, nations can pursue a variety of different policies in diplomacy and trade. Nationalism is the opposite of imperialism, or globalism, or transnationalism.
Just because we're making a claim here, I want to make sure I understand this. Let's make sure we have a good definition of imperialism. a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Globalism. The operation or planning of economic and foreign policy on a global basis. I feel like I'm not spelling that right. That can't be the right. Is it the right spelling? That looks so weird. Okay, here we go. Scholarly research agenda and social phenomenon grown out of heightened interconnectivity between people and the receding economic and social significance of boundaries among nation states. So that would be kind of globalism, like removing national boundaries, right? Something like that, maybe. Maybe not. Yeah, so your traditional national boundaries become a little bit more invisible, or actually invisible.
Nationalism is the opposite of imperialism, or globalism, or transnational.
Okay, nationalism. Let's bring this back up. Identification of one's own nation. Identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment. No, that's kind of imposing intent. Did I see this definition before? Why do I feel like this has changed? I don't think I looked at that's from Oxford. I don't think I looked at that one. This one sounds a lot more biased. I didn't look at this one. Identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of interests of other nations. Now, this definition says that in most applications, practice of nationalism, they will exclude the interests of other nations, or maybe exclusion or just pure detriment of the interests of other nations. And that's imposing intent on the word, because you're saying to prioritize your country, whether it's positive or negative, is to inherently exclude, mostly in practice, will exclude or detriment the interests of other nations, or not be some other word for detriment, like some kind of damage, will in some way damage the interest of other nations or injure. This interpretation imposes intent in a negative connotation, and I believe that's completely unfair, because it can be inherently negative or positive or neutral. It's very, very case specific. I hadn't seen this one, so that's Oxford one. By the way, this one sucks. I guess, well, to be fair, let's say if everyone who identified as that was doing this, it would be fair to include that in your definition, I guess. But what would bug me, even in that case, if everyone who did this, what would bug me, even in that case, is the word especially, because this signifies that the intent of this will mean the conclusion of this, instead of may. It may, so in most cases, may be to the exclusion or detriment. That's a more neutral interpretation, even in that extreme scenario. So I don't know who's writing these definitions, but I'm just a regular dude, and that should be kind of changed, but whatever. And some people, here's another thing, some people may argue that's semantics. And I really hate when people say, oh, it's just a semantic. That's just semantics. Because when you do that, you almost nullify, or what's the right word? You discredit or discard the importance of clarification and specificity. It's like, it's just semantics. But you're trying to clarify and have a proper mutual definition. You can't just discard that intent, which will ultimately provide the best ultimate conclusion, ultimately, in ultimacation. So they're saying that nationalism is the opposite
Opposite of imperialism.
It's the opposite of imperialism, which I don't agree with. Because in practice, you can actually create a situation where nationalism uses imperialism and uses it in a mutually beneficial relationship. In that, let's propose a hypothetical situation, and I'm sure you could find literal historical happenings or things where this is played out. Let's say you had a nationalist within America. He wanted to secure the most amount of oil for his country. And he believed that He was looking out for his own interests. He had no care for the interests of other countries, simply that his would thrive. And in doing so, went to war through military force, occupied a territory of another country who owned that resource, oil. Whether that was a genuine war or maybe it was a subversion of the country in some way, directly, indirectly, maybe supporting rebel groups, maybe inciting people within the country to do something, which gave just cause for military intervention and military force, and then occupation of part of the country or a resource or whatever it may be. So, in other words, a nationalist person could use imperialism and a mutual relationship where they were not mutually exclusive, where they were not the opposite. They were, in fact, looking out for the interest of their country using these immoral methods. So because that situation, that hypothetical situation can potentially exist, and I'm sure has existed, whether literally or just by happening, by like there was a series of events and then, we just happened to occupy this territory, and then, we just happen to have this agreement where we get this at a way better cost than everybody else because of that. So to say this,
nationalism is the opposite of imperialism,
is completely disingenuous to theory and reality.
or globalism, or
Now, is nationalism the opposite of globalism? I would say most of the time, but not necessarily, because of the same philosophy that you could apply from nationalism and imperialism, you could apply to nationalism and globalism, where the country would participate in a global economy or policy to further their own interests without care for the actual policy, in that they could not really participate in the global effort or marketplace or policy. Do it as little as possible, but maybe they get a huge benefit from it. And had that benefit not existed, they would have not participated because of that potential nationalist priority. So I believe that situation can exist and probably does exist. I don't know enough to say that though.
It's nationalism,
and transnationalism. I would probably say the same thing about that with globalism. Like, it can exist in theory and in practice.
Or globalism, or transnationalism, which are all names for the attempt to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind under a single political authority.
Again, I just wanted to highlight how important it is to be very specific, because being specific like that allows for an all-encompassing interpretation.
The debate between nationalists and globalists, then, is over whether we should aspire to a world of many independent nations, or to be one unified superstate, like the Enlightened Federation of the Star Trek movies. A case can be made for both sides of the argument. But for the last 30 years, really since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union, the one world side has been dominant. Today, this is changing. Maybe not among elites, but among ordinary citizens, or as they're known in America, the deplorables. It turns out that a lot of people still think good borders make good neighbors. It's hardly surprising that people want to preserve the way of life they and their ancestors built up over centuries. The way of life they believe is best. It's human nature. Our strongest loyalties are to those who are closest to us, to our family, then the larger community or tribe, and finally to the nation.
It wasn't pausing. I think all the things he's saying here can be natural. Like, you can want to maintain tradition. It doesn't mean it's inherent in human behavior. In the same way that you can want to visit another country to embrace their culture and then potentially bring that culture home. You know, what he's describing may be human nature for one man or woman, but what I'm describing could be human nature for some other person. So is it human nature, or is it just a possibility?
They and their ancestors built up over centuries. The way of life they believe is best. It's human nature. Our strongest loyalties are to those who are closest to us.
And you're just kind of mixing those opinions with things that I would agree with. Like, I agree with human nature. You're most loyal to those you're closest to, or can be, even though you can be disloyal to the ones you're closest to.
To our family, then the larger community or tribe, and finally to the nation. Long ago, it was discovered that the key...
And I would agree. I think we touched on this before about how humans tend to care and things in proximity to them. And as they need mental, psychological, physical things in closest proximity to be satisfied first before they can outwardly give or express those things. So that in this way, this describes what I'm speaking in a triangle, where I would view it more as a circle and then like a hard circle and then lighter rings as they go out, and like almost like a pebble drop, and how it ripples outwards, and the farthest ripple gets like the weakest or the shortest wavelength.
The key to human freedom is to build political life out of this natural loyalty. By putting decision-making in the hands of the family, the community, and the independent nation, you could get people to cooperate with one another.
But that's to not say that a globalist approach is inherently bad, because globalism is, if you think about it, it's just an extension of what we already have. It goes like household, then it goes near community, then it goes like city, then it goes state. And there's, like political and just like psychological boundaries within them. Like the hard political lines would be like, okay, city, what's the other one? Municipality, city, state, federal in terms of government. In terms of community and like psychology, it would be like family, friends, neighbors, then municipality, city, state, maybe region. So in essence, globalism is just where those levels exist. It's just saying, well, let's just go another level. Instead of stopping at the country, let's stop at the world. But it's very, very difficult to keep a large country together. And I think history has shown that like the bigger the empire, maybe the harder the fall, or it's inevitable that it will break up into smaller portions. And also when you're including so many diverse amount of people, thoughts, morals, principles into one form of policy and governance, that becomes an extreme problem just to handle that amount of people. Like, I mean, we're a country of 300 plus million people, but the world is, my God, how many people are in the world now? 7.5 billion? So you go from, is this even 10%? It's not even 10%. The US isn't even 10% of the entire world's population. It's like 5%. So when you, and these aren't even like, when we talk about America and principles and ideas, we're talking about simply Western thought. We're not even including the other kinds of thoughts today which exist in the world on a large or small scale, which completely contradict Western values. And so although it is just another level, it is exponentially greater. There is no linear line that it's like, it doesn't go like this. It doesn't go city, state, federal, globe. It goes something like city, state, federal, country, globe. It just shoots way up there.
Join in the common defense and willingly obey laws. The only alternative to this kind of community and nation-based politics is to use force, to coerce obedience. In the 20th century, communism and Nazism both sought to impose a universal vision at gunpoint. Both the communists and the Nazis were imperialists. They wanted to eliminate the independent nations of the world.
That's mostly true, although I'd love to hear criticism on that.
Nationalism holds that borders are crucial. The border is where each nation's ambitions should stop. This idea first appears in the Bible, where Moses gives borders to Israel and tells the Jews they'll be punished if they trouble their neighbors. True to its biblical roots, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century made the independent nation-state the political cornerstone of the modern world. When Henry VIII declared that England would no longer obey dictates from Rome, he became Europe's first true nationalist. Soon, additional nations declared their independence, the Dutch from Spain and America from Britain, to cite just two examples. The competition among these newly independent peoples led to an explosion of innovation, bringing unprecedented progress in science, industry, and government. For nearly 400 years, the principle of national independence served as the foundation for a better, freer world. But World War I and World War II changed everything. Traumatized by these catastrophic conflicts, many now seek comfort in a simplistic narrative, ceaselessly repeated, that nationalism caused 2 world wars and the Holocaust.
I do believe I believe with his conclusion of that's true, is they're attempting to conclude in some simple fashion and like deduce just a simple word from it when it's in fact very complex or just involved a lot of different events.
But this is one of the great untruths of our time. Adolf Hitler was no nationalist. He was an imperialist. If his ambitions had been limited to ruling Germans, it would have been terrible for Germany. But the French, the British, the Russians, and everyone else would have been spared a world war.
And again, this is where I would disagree. Although Hitler was an imperialist, he wanted the values of his nation so that he expanded the border to just include everything.
If his ambitions had been limited.
In other words, he was and is both. And that's an example of how you can have both in the same. You can have a nationalist who is behaving and is imperialist.
Limited to ruling Germans, it would have been terrible for Germany. But the French, the British, the Russians, and everyone else would have been spared a world war. Sadly, European elites learned the wrong lesson, believing that independent nations are inherently dangerous. Better, they reasoned, that all countries should live under one government. In 1992, this vision gave birth to the European Union. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher hated the idea. She didn't want the bureaucrats in Brussels making decisions for Brits in Birmingham. But in the utopian 1990s, Britain thought it was better to dump Thatcher and go with Brussels. It's the spirit of Margaret Thatcher, and indeed of Henry VIII, that reasserted itself in Britain's vote for independence from Europe in June 2016. Donald Trump tapped into the same spirit of nationalism 5 months later in November 2016. Nationalism is making a comeback. If you care about freedom, you should hope it succeeds. I'm Yoram Chazoni.
And I don't think it's, disingenuous to say that freedom equates to nationalism. It can.
Author of The Virtue of Nationalism for Prager University.
Okay. Who's the other guy I wanted to watch? Oh, it was the debunking. Let's see if this guy...
America has been shifting further and further to the right. But there's always been a roadblock in terms of how far to the right they can shift, because whenever they really dive into nationalism, militarism, xenophobia, and various forms of white identity politics, a lot of people raise an eyebrow or two because you sound kind of fascist there. But especially in the age of Trump, the boundaries between the mainstream and the far right are becoming harder and harder to delineate. And so not just the alt-right, but the right-wing in general are trying to revive various nationalist concepts, including the term itself. But again, their main roadblock is that people can very quickly connect the obvious dots between nationalism and more overt racism and fascism. There are 2 main ways that the right tries to gaslight their way around this. Option 1, actually, that was...
Okay, I already disagree with how he's interpreting this kind of stuff, because he's just assuming that all discourse is gaslighting, or most of what he hears is gaslighting.
All the left. Slavery and the Nazis, all that stuff was done by progressive hippie SJWs. And/or option 2, redefine all of the terms and revise history. Not the good kind of revisionism that honestly reevaluates, but incredibly deceptive revisionism. Which brings us to PragerU's latest abomination, why you should be a nationalist.
Britain votes to leave the European Union. The United States elects a president who says he'll put America first. Around the world, nationalism is winning elections. Many see this nationalist revival as the great danger of our time, fearing that nationalism will take us back to a more primitive and racist past. But it wasn't long ago that great political figures, such as Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, David Ben-Gurion and Mahatma Gandhi, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, recognized what I call the virtue of nationalism.
There are going to be several points in the video where it seems like I'm nitpicking, but the speaker makes so many errors in this video that may seem minor, but actually very important. So I'm going to have to frequently stop the video to address them. Anyways, this is a very bizarre list of people that he's chosen because, in reality, they had wildly different worldviews and outlooks on foreign policy. Starting with Woodrow Wilson, no, he was not a nationalist. He was one of the most important internationalists in history and was instrumental in the founding of the League of Nations. Next, he chose Teddy Roosevelt, who absolutely was a nationalist. So nationalistic, in fact, that he was basically an imperialist, keep that in mind. David Ben-Gurion, two-time Prime Minister of Israel, was also a nationalist. So much so that when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, he had Israel, with help of Britain and France, and to the horror of the international community, invade Egypt for control of the canal. So far, he has included an internationalist and two nationalists who...
It seems like he's blending nationalism and imperialism already, so he may already have a biased definition of those two words or viewpoint.
Were so nationalistic that they were over-imperialists. Gandhi was a nationalist in the sense that he wanted national sovereignty, independence from Great Britain, and that kind of nationalism makes perfect sense. In fact, Gandhi specifically spoke out against aggressive nationalism and imperialism. So far, this video has lumped in the concepts of liberal internationalism, aggressive nationalism, and national sovereignty into one all-inclusive category, keep that in mind. Next is Ronald Reagan. In some ways, okay, sure, especially when it came to the military, but in other ways, not at all. He literally called for open borders with Mexico. He was a free trader, and he was heavily involved in world affairs both aggressively and diplomatically. So he's really too complicated to put in a single category. But yes, Margaret Thatcher, she was a nationalist. So you have two examples of aggressive nationalism, an example of standard nationalism, one very mixed bag, the basic concept of national independence, and a liberal internationalist. This list makes no sense unless nationalism is just whatever you want it to mean, which is exactly what he's going for.
So what is this virtue? A nationalist believes that the world is governed best when nations are free to chart their own independent course, cultivating their traditions and pursuing their interests without interference.
So the definition of nationalism that he gives here is just national sovereignty, something that nobody disagrees with, and the definition is almost passable under certain established definitions. So again, I'm going to have to nitpick something that might seem minor but becomes extremely important. He portrays nationalism as something collective among all nations, when in reality, nationalism refers to your nation in particular. A nationalist need not care about the sovereignty of a nation on the other side of the world, only about the sovereignty, interests, and power of their nation. America First is not an abstract idea about the independence of all nations. It's about this particular nation, even if it's at the expense of other nations. Nationalism is not about our nations and our people for all of humanity. It's about my nation and my people. And keep in mind that most definitions of nationalism are not so generous.
Nationalism is not about racism. All nations are internally diverse. And it isn't about isolationism. Of course, nations can pursue a variety of different policies in diplomacy and trade.
This is something that I see a lot from people arguing in favor of nationalism. They understand that nobody is against a healthy amount of patriotism or basic national identity. So they say, nationalism isn't about racism, militarism, xenophobia, isolationism, or blind patriotism. It's just about loving your country and wanting it to succeed. And by the way, I think that we should kick out the immigrants, ramp up military spending, build a border wall, ban certain groups of migrants, and pull out of every international deal and organization that doesn't immediately suit our interests. Can anyone name a single major nationalist movement throughout history other than a national independence movement? So a nationalist movement
He's kind of doing the same thing that he's arguing against what this video does, but he's just adding more things to it. Like he's lumping in so many things together of a possibility, which is what that guy did too.
An organization that was not obsessed with controlling immigration and racist fear-mongering. Sure, nationalism is technically not necessarily racist, but if you had a Venn diagram of people who are militaristic, flag-waving, America first, say anything bad about America and you're a commie nationalist, and the people who have problematic views about immigrants and people of color, you would just have a wobbly circle, like at least.
He's blending in so many different ideas and selectively interpreting, like it's almost the argument of like, well, this happens, this is what I see happen, so come on. That's the exact argument I'm getting from this. And he's lumping all these different ideas together. He's like, well, they sometimes do this and this, so this is what they do. I mean, come on, this is what they do. The come on argument, I guess you could call it.
It's 90% overlap. Please explain to me why all of these nationalist movements in Europe became so deeply concerned about sovereignty or something during the migrant crisis.
For example...
Sure, nationalism is tech an organization.
For example, one person might genuinely think, I think that we need to kick out, or that we should kick out the immigrants. And another person could genuinely think, I want immigration to be at a specific volume of intake. And another person could say, an immigrant here illegally who has taken the place of another immigrant shouldn't be here. And another person could say, I don't believe a person who has immigrated here should receive the benefits of a person who has participated in a system for their entire life. I don't believe they should get that accumulation without any input into it. So there's so many different arguments. That's just a few of them. And he's kind of just nitpicking stuff, which like is very, very ironic in that he's pointing this out with the Prager video. And for some reason, this is kind of, it seems like a trend that I see, that because they find something that's to them or objectively morally inconsistent, they then are just blinded by their own logical inconsistencies and omissions and selective interpretations and misinterpretations. So it's like you take the worst case and you scrunch it down and then conclude from that, instead of doing what I'm saying, which is that yes, you could have someone exactly like that, or you could have these very nuanced arguments which are inherently not immoral. They're more in favor of merit and accountability rather than a racism or a nationalism or something immoral. So just the argument that he's coming from seems very, it appears that it's in good faith, but it's not. Or he's just unaware of what he's doing.
That doesn't immediately suit our interests. Can anyone name a single major nationalist movement throughout history other than a national independence movement, so a nationalist movement taking place in an already sovereign nation, that was not obsessed with controlling immigration and racist fear-mongering? Sure, nationalism is technically not necessarily racist, but if you had a Venn diagram of people who are militaristic, flag-waving, America first, say anything bad about America and you're a commie nationalist, and the people who have problematic views about immigrants and people of color, you would just have a wobbly circle, like at least 90% overlap. Please explain of color, you would just have...
Just kind of making up stuff. That's just kind of like almost like a confirmation bias conclusion. This is what I see, therefore this is how the world operates. And he doesn't understand that even what he sees is still a filter of the reality. In other words, if you get your information from online through interaction, you have to realize that there are so many people viewing your conversation or media and not interacting, and you're not getting that information from them. And there was a great, I just heard a great, oh God, this is a great similarity. What is it? The survival bias? The survivalship bias is the logical error of concentrating on the people or things that made it past some selection process and overlooking those that did not, typically because of their lack of visibility. This can lead to some false conclusions in different ways. It is a form of selection bias. Selection bias is the bias introduced by the selection of individuals, groups, or data for analysis in such a way that proper randomization is not achieved, thereby ensuring that the sample obtained is not representative of the population intended to be analyzed. It is sometimes referred to as the selection effect. The phrase selection bias most often refers to this distortion of a statistical analysis, resulting from the method of collecting samples. If the selection bias is not taken into account, then some conclusions of the study may be false. This is the exact principle I see from so many online commentators and people interacting with each other, debaters, pundits, a selection bias of principles and philosophies and ideas. And they don't paint a full picture, and they don't have the data, they don't have the groups of data from individuals, from groups, to paint an all-encompassing picture. Survivalship bias can lead to an overly optimistic beliefs because failures are ignored, such as when companies that no longer exist are excluded from analysis of financial performance. It can also lead to the false belief that the success in a group have some special property rather than just coincidence. For example, correlation proves causality. For example, if 3 of 5 students with the best college grades went to the same high school, that can lead one to believe that the high school must offer an excellent education when, in fact, it may just be a larger school instead. This can be better understood by looking at the grades of all the other students from that high school, not just from the ones who made the top 5 selection process. Exactly. You must recognize and eliminate your bias, or your selection bias, and all other kind of biases. Bias. In cats. Okay. The old cat landing bias. Okay, so it's very interesting, because I wonder if like there's any formal definition of this used in language and conversation, because this is the exact thing I see. This is what I've seen in every video, and some more guilty than others. And this is what I try to adhere to. I try to adhere to an all-encompassing viewpoint. Instead of, I recognize that I don't see the entire picture, and people don't understand that they have this bias that then directly or indirectly causes them to omit things and then come to this conclusion, they come to this conclusion that does not recognize that omission.
A wobbly circle, like at least 90% overlap.
There's also, this is what he's saying. There's also 90% overlap between the people who say, I'm not against immigration, just illegal immigration, and the people who support reducing the numbers of legal immigrants. If they were genuinely only concerned with the process and not the immigrants, then they would be trying to positively reform the immigration system. That's not true. That's completely not true. Because it's possible to not want an illegal immigrant to just instantly gain benefits where there is no merit. And it's possible for that to just anger you and say, I don't want to either just give them that benefit, or I don't want them taking the place of another legal immigrant. It's a totally possible. I'm sure that happens all the time. Like, why does it have to mean that this made up statistic, that's the conclusion? I mean, it's a very real argument to say if there's an illegal immigrant, should they or should they not be here because they're taking the place of someone else who has gone through the proper forms of immigration and paid their dues or whatever that may be.
Please explain to me why all of these nationalist movements in Europe became so deeply concerned about sovereignty or something during the migrant crisis. Why does America First start with calling undocumented immigrants rapists?
And it's another form of like, come on argument. Like, well, isn't it ironic it happened during this period? Most people that I see do this and that, and therefore this is what it is. So come on.
It kind of reminds me of the Civil War was about states' rights thing. A state's right to do what? Slavery. So this is about the rights of a sovereign nation. The right of a sovereign nation to do what? Kick out the immigrants. And I know that some conservative is going to rush in about how immigrant isn't a race, migrant isn't a race, illegal isn't a race, and it's just a coincidence that these people we're rationally afraid of are brown, and it's just a coincidence that I'm so offended by the concept of racial bias, and it's just a coincidence that I think systemic racism is just an excuse for black people to get ahead, and it's just a coincidence that I'm so against admitting migrants from the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, but Ireland is fine because culture or something.
Nationalism is...
Now let's let's take this idea and break it down to its simplest form. What if you owned a house, you had a family, okay? You went out and you harvested all the food for your house every week, every month, every year. So throughout time, you have like a short-term supply of food, you have a long-term supply of food. You're storing grains in some kind of refrigerator downstairs. I don't know. Either way, you're cultivating food, you're harvesting food, and you're accumulating everything for your household. Is it wrong to say, I wish to keep that which I have cultivated and harvested? Is it not an argument to say, well, I have to give up this grain in my refrigerator for someone else who hasn't done any harvesting? They came into the neighborhood and they just said, I want this. It's like, do I have to give it to them? Am I under some kind of obligation? And is it wrong to bring the argument of, well, you haven't done any work to cultivate and harvest any of the food? And also, there is another neighbor who had just started working to cultivate and harvest the field, and you're jumping in line of them and demanding a cut of the harvest. Why not give it to the person who went through the proper chain and put in some kind of work and effort? Why not address them first? Is that an inherently wrong discussion to have? And is it inherently wrong to feel that that person had been cheated in some way and that this is your chance? Or this is now something that has enough to set you off to be like, well, wait, that person shouldn't get it. You know, whereas you might have been quiet before because you didn't either see the problem or there wasn't enough of that happening at the same time for it to, you know, strike something in your mind. I don't believe there's anything wrong with that argument. Even though it can go in the wrong way and say, I don't want any immigration. I don't want anybody coming into the country. Like, that's also a possibility. But you can't ignore the fact that there's a possibility of, well, someone went through the proper chain, so why would I have to address this other person first? Or why would I have to give them benefits at all? Why would they have to be here in the first place? And then the opposite side of that, it's like, well, what if you add in all these complications, such as, well, the person was here illegally, they had a kid, now their kid is an actual citizen by law, or naturalization, or would that be naturalization? Even if it might or might not be, but either way, you've had somebody who's been there illegal for a long time, and then what do you do? Morally, what do you do? Which kind of complicates things. So you have kind of two different arguments. You have like a philosophical argument of, is it wrong to even say something along the lines of an illegal immigrant shouldn't be here, and we should prioritize a legal immigrant first. And subsequently, should that illegal immigrant be here in the first place? And then in addition to that, if there is a situation where the person has been here illegally for so long, should we keep them here or should we not keep them here? And what is the moral and better choice to do, if any? But it's a very complicated subject. And for someone to view that argument in purely the negative, disingenuous to how complicated the argument is and how people have different intent. And it's just not purely negative intent, because that's, even in the case of that's what you mostly see, because you might be seeing the survivalship bias or just any kind of selection bias.
The opposite of imperialism, or globalism, or transnationalism, which are all names for the attempt to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind under a single political authority.
This is the first time that the video really goes completely off the rails, but it won't be the last. Imperialism is not like globalism or transnationalism. Imperialism is not a, quote, attempt to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind under a single political authority. Imperialism is not a bunch of people cooperating and holding hands. Imperialism is me saying that my nation is superior, that my nation is so superior to yours that we have the right to conquer and exploit you for your labor and resources. Aside from being insane, this is the first major contradiction of the video. By stating that nationalism is the opposite of imperialism, globalism, and transnationalism, you've eliminated most of...
Is there a case for positive imperialism through diplomacy? I'm not sure. It doesn't sound like there is, though. Would you argue that something like the Knights Templar bringing Christianity, wouldn't that would be a form of imperialism, maybe? I suppose you theoretically could have a positive application of imperialism. So let's say there's a country but would the methods to do so be in contradiction or kind of like immoral? Would they have to be immoral? But anyway, let's suppose that there's a country which is a first world country, which has Western values, has some kind of law and order, uses logic, just anything Western kind of US based. And let's say there's an island, that definitely not how you spell island. Let's say that there's an island just filled with cannibals, people eating each other. Let's say it's a big island. It's a big island. Let's say it's a big giant island. Like they have their own government. They just happen to eat everyone. They're doing completely immoral things. They have a government which is just killing everyone, which is just enslaving people. All terrible things. Would imperialism from another country onto this island people, would an imposing first world beliefs and practices onto the island people, would that be a bad thing? And if done through some form of diplomacy or direct or indirect subversion, where maybe you use propaganda to influence them, maybe you incite them through transparency into maybe the hypocrisy of the crazy government. They're like, hey, we're eating everybody. We're not getting paid to do anything. We're slaves. So I believe there is a possible moral application of imperialism in that case. Even though the intent of the country who is being imperialist may be to incorporate them in their marketplace. For example, what if the island people also had fish that we just really liked? We really wanted to fish there. But because they're absolutely crazy, they're eating each other, enslaving each other, there's no market for us to trade with. But once we bring them into a first world kind of system, then we can establish a marketplace, and then we can satisfy our country's need. We can have some kind of cooperative nation to trade with. Where'd the definition go? So that would be an example of extending your influence and maybe power through diplomacy without the use of military force. And you could argue that would be a good practice of imperialism. Now, does that actually happen? Probably not. But if it does happen, it's probably way more complicated. And I'm sure if you look through historical events, it would be more trade-off. For example, like trying to spread Christianity or something like that. It's like, well, you're trading maybe one thing for another, and it's not such clear-cut black and white like the island people example. But just something interesting to think about, that imperialism doesn't inherently have to be a bad thing.
That we have the right to conquer and exploit you for your labor and resources.
And his conclusion is just purely based in that. Like, it's just, we want to exploit you, we want to conquer you, and it's specifically within like the context of military interaction of some kind.
Aside from being insane, this is the first major contradiction of the video. By stating that nationalism is the opposite of imperialism, globalism, and transnationalism, you've eliminated most of the examples you gave of nationalist figures at the beginning of the video. Wilson is definitely out, Teddy Roosevelt is definitely out, Ben Gurion is probably out, while Gandhi, Reagan, and Thatcher can be debated. As for the part about a world government, no. Almost nobody thinks that a world government is a good idea, or at least a sensible one. Nobody is saying that nations are inherently bad or that we should be completely unpatriotic. This entire video is about steelmanning nationalism to just the idea of having sovereign nations and nothing else, and strawmanning internationalism as a one world government and nothing else. Am I misunderstanding something about what he's saying?
So the ironic part is he's kind of doing the same thing, but just in a more complex way of when we looked at like his analysis of things, like just with that selection bias and survivorship kind of bias.
Debate between nationalists and globalists, then, is over whether we should aspire to a world of many independent nations, or to be one unified superstate, like the Enlightened Federation of the Star Trek movies.
Well, I guess not. This is honestly the most bizarre PragerU video that I've ever responded to. And again, nationalists use this false dichotomy to shield their actual views. You're either a nationalist or you're against the very idea of a nation and want a global federation.
A case can be made for both sides of the argument. But for the last 30 years, really since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union, the one world side has been dominant. Today, this is changing. Maybe not among elites, but among ordinary citizens, or as they're known in America, the deplorables. It turns out that a lot of people still think good borders make good neighbors.
That is so euphemistic. How silly of us to call them deplorable because they want good borders. Surely that's the best way for us to be a good neighbor. We want a good border, no littering on the border. No, they were called deplorables, the half or so of Trump supporters that Hillary referred to, because they're racists who wanted to deport millions of innocent people and ban Muslims from entering the country. And
very, very broad conclusion there. Just very, very blanket use of that conclusion.
By the way, how has that hypothesis worked out? Has our relationship with Mexico improved by constantly demonizing them and their people?
It's hardly surprising that people want to preserve the way of life they and their ancestors built up over centuries. The way of life they believe is best.
Yeah, our way of life. Those stupid Italians bringing in pizza. This is America, where we eat Chipotle and Taco Bell.
Their food and celebrating
What do you mean their food? It's American
what they find
food.
convenient to celebrate about their story.
What, you think you own tacos now or something? I love this. It's so crazy.
No one does, by the way.
Oh, really? Because it sounds like you feel like you own tacos. No. I feel like I do. I feel like they're an American food, and I'm going to keep eating them, even though I agree with Jeff Sessions.
I'm glad you do. No, and I think everyone should. Tacos, guacamole, and we should all celebrate each other's cultures. We feed off each other. It's what makes us
each other's cultures. No. It's an American
diverse
food.
and stronger. Feeding off each other's cultures, borrowing from each other's cultures, learning from each other's cultures.
I'm from San Diego, man. Those are my tacos. Mine.
It's human nature. Our strongest loyalties are to those who are closest to us, to our family, then the larger community or tribe, and finally to the nation.
You know, I just cannot put my finger on why this ideology could be so attractive to racists and isolationists. Now, of course, I'm loyal to my family and my community and my nation, but what does that have to do with any of this? I don't have to be closed-minded or aggressive about it. In fact, the statement that you're making has zero political implications. If we're talking about immigration or internationalism or anything that you can list as something nationalists are against, partaking in that does not suck any loyalty away from my family, community, or nation.
Long ago, it was discovered that the key to human freedom is to build political life out of this natural loyalty. By putting decision-making in the hands of the family, the community, and the independent nation, you could get people to cooperate with one another, join in the common defense, and willingly obey laws.
And nobody is against this. What exactly do you think the opposition or alternative to this is?
The only alternative to this kind of community and nation-based politics is to use force, to coerce obedience.
Quoting from Wikipedia's article in his book, reviewing the book for the New York Times, Justin Vogt called Herzoni's narrative a reductive approach that poses a false choice between an idealized order of noble sovereign nations and a totalitarian global government. Exactly right.
In the 20th century, communism and Nazism both sought to impose a universal vision at gunpoint. Both the communists and the Nazis were imperialists. They wanted to eliminate the independent nations of the world.
This video is so weird. Okay, with the Soviets, he's not 100% completely wrong, I guess, but the Nazis weren't trying to push a universal vision. They weren't, as you described, imperialists, which you described earlier as a, quote, attempt to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind under a single political authority. They weren't against the idea of the nation, quite the opposite. They were so into putting their nation and their people above other nations and people who they wanted to conquer, enslave, exterminate, and repopulate with their own people to achieve Lebensraum for their nation.
Nationalism holds that borders are crucial. The border is where each nation's ambitions should stop. This idea first appears in the Bible, where Moses gives borders to Israel and tells the Jews they'll be punished if they trouble their neighbors. True to its biblical roots, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century made the independent nation-state the political cornerstone of the modern world. When Henry VIII declared that England would no longer obey dictates from Rome, he became Europe's first true nationalist. Soon, additional nations declared their independence, the Dutch from Spain and America from Britain, to cite just two examples. The competition among these newly independent peoples led to an explosion of innovation, bringing unprecedented progress in science, industry, and government. For nearly 400 years, the principle of national independence served as the foundation for a better, freer world.
Who are you arguing against? Look, if this video were just why a single worldwide superstate is a bad idea, I mean, it'd be pointless, but I wouldn't disagree with it. But this isn't about that. This is about overcoming the obstacle that all nationalists face, that we have learned that putting your nation above and against other nations and people can and will have horrific consequences, that we should cooperate and accept instead of competing and alienating. Who are you arguing against? Look, if this video were just why a single worldwide superstate is a bad idea, I mean, it'd be pointless, but I wouldn't disagree with it. But this isn't about that. This is about overcoming the obstacle that all nationalists face, that we have learned that putting your nation above and against other nations and people can and will have horrific consequences, that we
Can and will. I still think he's concluding that it just will, when maybe the country whose nationalist is being imposed upon by someone else, and they're for some reason morally right in whatever the topic is, and they wish to exclude them for whatever reason. It's just everything is very, like, it will happen. If you prioritize your country first, you will ultimately want to, like, kill other people for some reason. Let's listen to that again.
But this isn't about that. This is about overcoming the obstacle that all nationalists face, that we have learned that putting your nation above and against other nations and people can and will have horrific consequences.
It's going to have horrific consequences if you prioritize your country first. The will part is it's just a possibility. It can happen, and if it does happen, there's a potential that it will have horrific consequences, or there's a potential that it will benefit people ultimately, or the people in the country ultimately. There's still that underlying subliminal, like, negative connotation attached to the word, which is just never acknowledged in the video.
Is that we should cooperate and accept instead of competing and alienating. We kind of learned from World War I, so we created the League of Nations, and we really learned from World War II, so we created the UN. So nationalists need a way to skirt the lessons of World War I and World War II.
But World War I and World War II changed everything.
And again, it's all proposed in a fashion of nationalists can't be involved in international policy or affairs, that it's completely black and white. It's still what I'm getting from this kind of video or this guy's interpretation.
Traumatized by these catastrophic conflicts, many now seek comfort in a simplistic narrative, ceaselessly repeated, that nationalism caused 2 world wars and the Holocaust. But this is one of the great untruths of our time. Adolf Hitler was no nationalist.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Adolf Hitler was no nationalist. He was an imperialist. If his ambitions had been limited to ruling Germans, it would have been terrible for Germany. But the French, the British, the Russians, and everyone else would have been spared a world war.
The nation, their nation, was everything to the Nazis. This is why that small problem with his definition was so important earlier. German nationalism has nothing to do with Polish sovereignty, or French sovereignty, or Danish sovereignty. It was about Germany. In fact, it was the internationalists who cared about the sovereignty of the nations attacked by Germany. Germany, and to be German was everything to the Nazis. They weren't internationalists. They didn't care about the League of Nations or international law. They spat in the face of the League of Nations and international law. They were against globalization and internationalism in every way. They didn't even want to trade with the rest of the world in the end, and they certainly didn't want immigrants. They wanted eventual autarky, secured by their Lebensraum. They wanted to prove to the world that they were the superior people, that they were the greatest and the strongest, the Übermensch. They weren't trying to create a universal vision of a globalist open borders utopia. They wanted their borders to grow and conquer and destroy. Notice how when he's talking about popular historical figures, the definition of nationalism is ridiculously flexible. But when the Nazis come up, all of a sudden the definition is twisted to arbitrarily exclude them. And something that these charlatans all have in common is that while they're pushing these wild untruths, they're like, oh, you guys have been lied to. I'm here to tell you the truth. All those historians and political scientists, at best, they're all wrong. At worst, they're all in on the conspiracy. Okay, the reason we teach that the world wars were fueled by nationalism is because it's true. World War I was about these European nations who were itching for a chance to prove that they were the most powerful country with the strongest military and the best weapons. When Germany gave Austria-Hungary their blank check pledge, it wasn't because they so deeply cared about Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was so that they could prove that they were the tough guys now. And again, World War II is about these nations who believed that they were superior and they deserved to conquer.
Sadly, European elites learned the wrong lesson, believing that independent nations are inherently dangerous. Better, they reasoned, that all countries should live under one government. In 1992, this vision gave birth to the European Union. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher hated the idea. She didn't want the bureaucrats in Brussels making decisions for Brits in Birmingham. But in the utopian 1990s, Britain thought it was better to dump Thatcher and go with Brussels. It's the spirit of Margaret Thatcher, and indeed of Henry VIII, that reasserted itself in Britain's vote for independence from Europe in June 2016.
He kind of has a point with the EU, but I want to stress that every member of the European Union voluntarily joined and cannot be made to do anything major. They are all sovereign nations. Any step towards ever closer union has to be agreed upon by every single participating member. And if they don't like it, they can leave. And again, it's not a coincidence that this surge of anti-Europeanism and nationalism came on the heels of the migrant crisis.
Donald Trump tapped into the same spirit of nationalism 5 months later, in November 2016.
You know, with Donald Trump, you can't even try to make the sovereignty argument like you did with Europe. But you are right that Donald Trump and his supporters, especially in 2016, encapsulated nationalism in every way. Economically with trade, threatening tariffs against our own allies, because it would supposedly put America first. On foreign policy, if America First Trump were president when Hitler invaded Poland, he would have said, well, what has Poland ever done for us? And this trade rhetoric may have won him points in the Rust Belt, which did secure him his victory, but what...
I don't know if he says that just to be funny or because he's serious, but that's another example of the come on argument. Come on. Don't you think he would do that? Come on. This is what he probably would have done. Come on. Come on, man.
Got him nominated in the first place, the bulk of his support was from his racism and xenophobia, his fear-mongering about immigrants and refugees. When Trump promised to ban...
Is that an actual... There's got to be a come on. The come on argument. It's got to be a thing. I hope it is. Come on. Come on argument. It's got to be a thing. Wait, what's... Sorry, we're going on a little tangent here.
I know a lot of you are already on my side. And for you naysayers, I have two strong words for you. Come on. Come on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, sure. All right.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's perfect. Also, I wanted to look at something else extremely briefly. I'm going to keep that there. We're going to come back to this.
Muslims from entering... On foreign policy, if America First Trump were president when Hitler invaded Poland, he would have said, well, what has Poland ever done for us? And this trade rhetoric may have won him points in the Rust Belt, which did secure him his victory, but What got him nominated in the first place, the bulk of his support, was from his racism and xenophobia, his fear-mongering about immigrants and refugees. When Trump...
Racism, xenophobia, fear-mongering. But what specific examples? How was he racist?
Promised to ban Muslims from entering the country, that was supposed to be the end of it. That was supposed to end his campaign. But his base loved it.
Donald Trump tapped into the same...
Promised to ban Muslims from entering the country, that was supposed to be the end of it. That was supposed to end his campaign. But his base loved it.
I don't think that was a racist... What was even the meaning? Okay. The Trump Muslim ban? What was the reason behind this? Something about refugees? But okay, let's suppose this was true. Why wouldn't that ban have been extended indefinitely, right? Why would it be just this covert operation to ban? Like, isn't there a different reason behind that?
Donald Trump tapped into the same spirit of nationalism 5 months later in November 2016. Nationalism is making a comeback. If you care about freedom, you should hope it succeeds. I'm Yoram Chazoni, author of The Virtue of Nationalism for Prager University.
And there we have it. This facade about national sovereignty and freedom is about defending nationalism, the real, ugly nationalism with the pretty nationalism in the video, where the only alternative is some imaginary global tyranny. We are living in a time where ultranationalism and all of its byproducts are making a comeback. Things that used to be unsayable are becoming sayable. Nationalism doesn't stop with its initial public rhetoric. It will get so much worse if we allow it to. It is always playing with fire. And
it is not always playing with fire. In the same way, it is not to play with fire to say, I prioritize the lives within my household above all others. And that is not to say I exclude the well-being of others and I am not available to help them or extend my household beliefs and philosophies on to other neighbors and situations.
On the subject of nationalism, as I'm recording this video, Trump is holding the threat of a shutdown over Congress to get over $5 billion for the wall. You know, the one that Mexico is going to pay for, of course. That's nowhere near what it will cost to build and maintain it, but just off the top of my head, I can think of over a dozen better ways that money could be spent. But before Trump started playing hardball with Congress, it didn't seem like he was going to get the funding. So his supporters literally started a GoFundMe campaign for it. And, you know, in a previous video, I mockingly said they should do that as part of the point I was making about how private donations could never replace government spending, and here they are to prove me right. As I'm recording this, it's been 4 days and they've only raised 1.3% of their $1 billion goal. And since most of the energy is from the first few days, I doubt that they'll ever hit 3%. And even then, that would just be 3% of a goal that's absurdly small. Actually building and maintaining the thing would cost tens of billions of dollars, not $1 billion. So I rest my case on the idea that we could have a voluntary tax system. Also, Justice Ginsburg recently had to undergo cancer surgery. Just hang in there, RBG, please. Anyways, I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. It's not the video I was planning on making, but that PragerU video is one of the most egregious that they've done. If you enjoyed my response to it, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter. And I'm happy to announce that
I don't think it's egregious, but I understand the critique. Some of it's warranted, but a lot of his critique was hypocritical in that he did a majority of what he accused Prager of doing, ironically. Oh, okay. Well, get rid of this stuff. So, I think we have a decent idea of some kind of trend or the rhetoric on the online or media side of nationalism. Just a very, very light touch on it. And I think it's very important that we also look at the Pew, like something like Pew Research, or just something that touches on a different demographic and sample of people. So let's see if we can find anything with wider demographics and samples. So this is saying that in the sample that they analyzed, Europeans favoring right-wing populist parties are more likely to see culture as very important to identity. Notably, there is not much partisan difference about the link between the land of one's birth and the U.S. national identity. Roughly a third of Republicans, 35%, and Democrats, 32%, say being born in the US is very important. Slightly fewer independents, 29%, hold that view. Those on the right, more likely than those on the left, to say traditions are very important to national identity. Very interesting graphic. In some countries, there is also an ideological divide over the relationship between culture and nationality, with those on the right more significantly more likely than those on the left to link the two. In the UK, for instance, this right-left split is 30 percentage points. In France, the gap is 29 points, and in Poland, 21 points. Most white evangelical Protestants say it is very important to be Christian to be truly American. Older people more likely to see link between Christianity and nationality. Roughly 9 in 10 in the US, 92%, voice the view that to be truly American, it is very or somewhat important that a person speak English, with 70% saying it is very important. And these are all great things to know. I don't know what their sample size is, but these are great things to know. But also what's equally as great is to why they hold this belief. European opinions vary widely about the key components of national identity, but publics agree that language is fundamental. Across the 10 EU countries surveyed, a median of 97% think that being able to speak the national language is very or somewhat important. Language, the cornerstone of national identity. Of the national identity attributes included in the Pew Research Center survey, language far and away is seen as the most critical to national identity. Majorities in each of the 14 countries polled say it is very important to speak the native language to be considered a true member of the nation. So a little insight into what a general person may think. I don't know the sample size of that again, but what the general person may think nationalism or national identity is. So I think that was a good analysis into the wide spectrum of what people think about nationalism. I might find some more things to talk about with that, but I think in general, at least with the majority of online discussions, I normally find something that can be described best as a debate of survivalship bias. A debate that concludes based on a selection bias. And the more research that person does, the more they affirm their confirmation bias that they are on the right track. And by not challenging their own beliefs or analyzing their philosophical and pure definition of words themselves, they follow along into this path, along with peer herding of those ideas and confirming that they're right. They're herded into this argument and conclusion, which is just a small portion of what the actual argument is or can be, or is in reality. And I think it's a very difficult thing to see or to even acknowledge if you do see it. Because you have to admit that you haven't done the work properly, that you haven't accounted for everything, that you, because of that omission, or whether it was willing or unwillingly, there's potential outcomes and conclusions that may be correct or maybe more explain things better or might be the solution. And it's hard for your ego to recognize that, to willingly recognize that. You just have to admit that part of you is wrong. And sometimes in arguments, people want to have that course, that route with the selection bias and not acknowledging it or just not even knowing it's there, because you get this emotional involvement that may not be there had you've been educated and conscious of these problems and potential poor behaviors, poor forms of logic. So in terms of media, in terms of discussions online, in terms of just imposing this conversation onto somebody, it's not well suited. It doesn't grasp your ear. It doesn't sell to the media to have a wide spectrum of views and analysis and analyze all of the language all the way down to a basic definition of each word and potential interpretations of each word per person, per potential happening or outcome, it's a very, very difficult conversation to have, to first of all, to analyze, then to recognize, and it just doesn't sell well, like actually financially or conversationally or for the ego. So something else that I was thinking about along the same lines, something I see a lot with debate people, and something that I think is also a poor behavior, and something which I strive to do the exact opposite of, talking fast and having the fastest responses. We may see here, I don't know. Let's see.
Production and
and here
with debate
Thank you
champions.
for judging today. The two debaters sitting before you on stage are two
They'll usually be extremely fast talking.
Understand this, Pettit looks at the history of U.S. slavery. Now, imagine a slave with a average. Even in the U.S., according to the Global Slavery Index, here is that there might be...
The judge is really trying to see who is making...
The Congressional Budget Office explains that we spend $2.6 trillion on our current social safety net, both in large programs like are being harmed. But he needs to show why we need to give money to the people who are harming those workers. Second, we can help these workers in the negative...
...for any of these problems. I think that we should help the poor.
This is the champion here.
After World War II, President Roosevelt created the GI Bill. Much of the spending would certainly be cut. University, you
really hurting each other.
I don't think any topic you're discussing in depth can be analyzed properly at this speed. I mean, yes, you can understand what they're saying. You can understand like the deep meanings, but there's so much complexity which is missed even at that speed. I think it's what I strive to do is like intentionally limit the speed for clarification and to have proper intent and to try to remove or try to incorporate all perspectives and spectrums and interpretations so that the argument doesn't devolve into black and white scenarios. I believe that when you analyze things at a fundamental level, slowly, methodically, and properly, you'll arrive at a complex argument which encompasses way more than had you just briefly went over and concluded. Or not even briefly. You could at length do it, but just at a speed. I believe the speed is very important. And I think debaters and stuff like that have this, like they go extremely fast. But I think that also may be a behavior that some people might apply, and it might be a habit in like these kind of online discussions and forums and Facebook, social media, the news. And that might be a kind of habit along those lines of like, you know, how I was just analyzing it to suit the ego, to suit the conversation, to sell it financially, to sell it per your ego, per your affiliation, whatever it might be. So yeah, I think I'm going to end it there though. I think we learned a little bit, and maybe next time I'll have a little bit more to say on nationalism. But I think we're a good way through it. I think all in all, it's kind of my kind of understanding was that there's a negative connotation prescribed to nationalism, and I feel that's the reality. And whether it's intentional or not intentional, or whether it's, you know, I believe like a lot of the time too, that almost the meaning is different for each person almost. In these critiques of nationalism, they usually take like the worst case scenarios and say like, this will eventually happen because of this, when it's in reality, there's a lot more involved in just deducing that. But yeah, next time maybe we'll look at some of the Adam Smith stuff and Adam Smith and Marx, and how they had sort of a couple of similar viewpoints. But yeah, until then, feel free to follow all the social media stuff. There's links in the Twitch for YouTube. Subscribe there, follow, and I'll catch you guys next time.